So the premise of this book is that there are gaps in our faith journey. There's gaps between what we know about God and what we experience with God. And most of us have gaps in different areas of our faith journey. There's three that is outlined in the book. Today's gap is, I believe God is with me, but I struggle to see it. I struggle to see Him. I struggle to sort of experience that. Well, God, if you're with me, how do I know that? Where does that show up in my life? A couple of years ago, I was living in the islands, and I did some scuba diving because it was a fantastic deal. It was a lot of fun, not a bad way to spend a day off in tropical waters. And I did a dive with Pastor Gary once when we were traveling to another island, and we did a shark dive. That's kind of what it sounds like. It's diving with sharks. And we had a tour guide that took a crew of us down, and it made me think about how fast you have to be to outrun a grizzly. Faster than the next guy, right? So I was kind of thinking like that. How fast you have to be to outswim a shark? Well, just faster than the guy beside you. Now, I think Gary was thinking that too, and he was faster than me, but I think I was faster than some of the others. However, the way that it worked is they had giant chunks of frozen chum, like fish parts, that they froze on a piece of rebar, and they brought those along, and they would throw those, they'd put them on a rope that they had that was tied down to the reef, but they'd throw them overboard. One of their hired guys who knew what he was doing brought that down and would tie it on to this rope on the reef. And their whole point was like, don't worry, you have nothing to worry about. The shark is, they said, the shark is lazy. Okay, sharks are lazy. They'll never work for food if they can get it for free. So the way that we make this safe is by giving them free food. So if they were to try to get you for food, they'd have to really work at that, but they'll just eat this for free. So, very comforting. And when I got in the water with Gary, I had a fairly elevated heart rate, and I was rethinking my life decisions, and thinking, this is either like one of the most exciting things I'll ever do in my life, or this is one of the dumbest things I've ever done in my life. And thankfully, I'm still here, a couple of decades later, and it was quite fun. But I was, elevated heart rate, and you're breathing through a regulator and oxygen. So I burned through it fairly quick, though you're always trying to okay, stay calm. And it sounds like Darth Vader, not under the water, but when you breathe in that's how they got the Darth Vader breathing from this regulator. So you're like, okay. But your body is adjusting to the acute anxiety that you're feeling from swimming with sharks. Because that's not normally on your list of to-dos, but it was quite good. Now, there's another time that I encountered an animal, and my heart rate was very elevated, and I had a lot of adrenaline, and was really on edge. It felt like very acute anxiety. And that was when the alarm went off here at the church a couple of years ago, and it was 3 a.m., and I got the call. It was before we had cameras, so I couldn't see what was happening. So I raced down here, 3 in the morning, and unlocked the building, and I'm looking around, and because it's being triggered, and sure enough, there's a bat. There's a bat flying around here, and I'm trying to assess where it is. I couldn't see, but it just made sense from what they reported. They said, this sensor's triggered, and that sensor's triggered, and that's it. So I'm like, okay. So I'm closing, make sure the doors are closed. I'm looking around for this thing. Well, then it was up here by the stairs, kind of up in the top part by the roof, and I'm like, how do I get that thing down? It's 20 feet in the air. So I grabbed one of the kids' toys from the nursery, and I was trying to chuck this ball at this bat, and I couldn't hit it because it was near the corner, so I'd always hit like the top and it'd bounce, whatever. But my adrenaline's pretty high because, well, one, I got woken up at 3 a.m. because there's an alarm at the church, so you're like, okay, what's going on? And then two, I really hate birds and things that like swoop at your head. Bats would fit that category. And while size-wise, you're like, that's totally disproportionate. Nate, you're 6'4", and a bat is like, I just hate it when things dive at my head, okay? So I'm trying to figure out what to do with this bat. My adrenaline's going. 3 a.m., thankfully we didn't have security cameras because that footage would be quite hilarious. I went in to the boiler room and we have one of these super long light bulb poles to change these light bulbs that you can do it from the ground. So I grabbed one of these things, extended it's like 20 feet up. And so I had a broom beside me as well. And so I had this light bulb changer, and I finally poked at the bat and got it, and then dropped that, and then grabbed the broom, and I was just swinging the thing around as it came swooping around in the foyer there. All the other doors were closed, so it couldn't go into any of the rooms, but I'm literally my heart is just racing because I don't want this thing to dive bomb my head. And, so I had acute anxiety about this bat, even though I wasn't really in harm's way. Now, the shark dive, that acute anxiety there's real legit danger. The acute anxiety about the bat, other than for this purpose of sermon illustration, it's not something I really share. Because, again, I'm just glad there's no video. I did end up breaking the broom, though. When I hit that thing, I was like, die. And I snapped the broom, so I had to replace that. But there's different kinds of anxiety, and acute anxiety is what we feel when we have real danger. Our blood pressure goes up, our heart starts to beat really fast, and our brain is sharper, we have adrenaline in us, and we are ready because there are things in this life that are legitimate danger. And so we do have reactions that are acute in their anxiety because of the danger. And you can calm yourself down afterwards. After I had that bat dead on the floor and the broken broom, I got a bag and cleaned the thing up. And, all right. Now, I don't think I slept very well going back home by 4 a.m., but you can calm down after acute anxiety. However, there's another kind of anxiety, which is much more common, and most of us have it at some point, and it's called chronic anxiety. This is, basically, it's reactivity. Okay, reactivity. When we encounter our boss, or we encounter somebody, and we just know that every interaction with them, we just start a conversation, and we can feel the heat rise in our face, right? Maybe you're one of those people who gets really red-faced, and you can't hide it. Or maybe you can feel your heart beating fast when you're going into that conversation. Or maybe your brain just starts spinning, and you just have so many thoughts that are just unfocused, and they're just all over the place. And there's a chronic anxiety that can get ramped up, and it feels real in the moment. And there's a very real reaction that's going on in your body. One of the examples was that for those people who are people pleasers, when you see that someone is disappointed in you or you've let someone down, your body can start to react defensively, like you're under threat. Your anxiety can go up because you're like, oh no, I disappointed this person or this group, and you can start to feel anxious about that, if that's one of your things, if you're a people pleaser. But maybe you're a perfectionist, and you're one of those people who double, triple, quadruple checks an email before it goes out. And you think, man, if you made a mistake, if there's a grammatical error or two in there, it's literally the end of the world for you. That's what it feels like. And your reactivity is gets high if you think that you sent something out with your name on it and it had mistakes in it. And so there's a reactivity that comes, say, from perfectionism. And so the difference between acute anxiety and chronic anxiety is that acute anxiety has an actual threat, and chronic anxiety is a false threat. If I did something and I didn't get that approval that I was hoping for from someone else, am I really in danger? No. If you sent that email with an error or two in it, is your life at stake? No. And yet, the way that our bodies respond, it makes it feel real. The anxiety is real. It'll give you that adrenaline. But with chronic anxiety, it spreads that adrenaline out over a longer period of time. And so for some, we live with this chronic anxiety, that things make us anxious every day. Every time you have to go to work, every time you go to the grocery store, every time you have to encounter that person, your heart rate goes up a little bit. Your anxiety goes up a little bit. And we live with this chronic anxiety. But chronic anxiety is from a false threat. So the question is, what do you think you need that you don't really need? So we have lots of different false needs. Okay, and sometimes it can take a while for us to locate those. Like, well, what do you mean, false needs? It can be difficult because we just assume that they are real. Because when we feel these, they feel real. And it's inside of us, we feel that this is a very strong need, and so it just seems like it's the real deal. So for example, one of my false needs as well, like similar to the author, would be to be there for people when they're hurting. I like to be able to do that. And so you might think, well, why? That doesn't sound like a problem. Why is that a problem? And the problem is, if you have that need where you're always like, I have to be there for others, I have to be there for others, what happens is you probably overcommit. Because you're trying to be there for everybody. You don't want to let them down. That's another one. So you're willing to overcommit because you're like, no, I'll find a way. And you feel the need to be there for them. But sometimes the need is really that you want to feel needed. It's maybe they don't need you as much as you think they do. But you are feeling like it is really important that you're there for them. And sometimes it is. Sometimes that causes us to give people answers when they're not asking for them, or give advice. Maybe I'm the only one who does that. But oftentimes, when we get in a situation with somebody and they're in a difficult spot, we feel anxious because we don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. They just lost their dog. They just lost a friend. They just lost a loved one. Especially, when I was a chaplain, it was all the time. You're around death and suffering. You're encountering these things. And it's a really difficult thing to enter a room with people who are experiencing horrible things and trauma, and there's something that's pretty normal for us humans to feel like we have to say something. And if you've ever had that feeling, that's a false need. And it feels very real at the time. What should I say? I don't know what to say. I don't know. This is horrible. I don't know. Should I ask them a question? Should I tell them? I shouldn't tell them I love them. What should I tell them? No, I don't hardly know them, but this is horrible. So what do I say? I don't know. And then we feel anxious because of these false needs. We feel like I should have an answer. I should know what to do. But it's reactivity. And chronic anxiety, which is different. The acute is when you're really in danger, but chronic anxiety is the only form of anxiety that is contagious. So we can actually share this around with other people. You may or may not have noticed that. There's times when, and you may have a coworker or a family member, that when you engage with them or when they come over, they tend to be very anxious. And you feel different because they're there. Now, you can also share calmness. Sometimes they might want to be with you because you have a sense of calmness and peace. And so they catch that. But other times we share this chronic anxiety because it has a lot to do with reactivity. And reactivity is it's like autopilot for us. We often are not really even aware that we're reacting to something. We just do it. When I think of reactivity, it reminds me of an unreliable narrator. Now, maybe you watched the show. Did anybody ever watch the show The Wonder Years? Or maybe you've seen, they do this in movies too sometimes, like Shawshank Redemption had it. There's some other movies that they'll have a narrator, and the narrator tells you what's going on. It's usually a character in the movie or in the show. In The Wonder Years, there was a main character named Kevin. He was a boy and probably about 12 to 14, something there. And it's older Kevin that you hear narrating. So when I went to the house, I found this and that. When I went to school, I hated school because da-da-da-da. So the older Kevin is the narrator for Kevin's life, the young Kevin, as you watch the show unfold. But some movies and shows will use what's known as an unreliable narrator. It's where you have a narrator and you're following along and you trust them, but then there's some twist. And you find out, you're like, that narrator actually isn't telling the truth. Or that narrator doesn't have the full picture. So they're telling the story from their own perspective, and yet they're not correct. One of the famous ones would be the movie The Sixth Sense. And maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, but there's a narrator through the whole movie, and you're following the whole movie, and then right at the end, there's this twist. And you find out that the premise of the whole thing was false. You're like, what? And so anybody who's watched The Sixth Sense has watched it twice, because you didn't know that was the case until the very end, and then you're like, wait a minute, no way. No way. And then you watch the whole thing again, and you're like, man. And it's all solid. But the narrator through the whole thing was unreliable. And sometimes we have an unreliable narrator. We have our own voice, our own assumptions, there are things that orient us to the world, and yet the narrator can't always be trusted. And chronic anxiety is one of those factors. Chronic anxiety is an unreliable narrator. It gives us a false story to believe. Every human has up to 5 core false needs. These are the most common ones that are identified. But these are the most common areas where the unreliable narrator will target. So I don't know which one will stand out to you, but all of us will have some level of these as an issue for ourselves, that cause chronic anxiety. So the first one would be control. For you, if you're a control freak or somebody who says, I must have control, okay, that's an unreliable narrator. The control freak, they drive themselves to the party. No, I'll meet you there. They don't like feeling trapped or contained. If they're in a meeting and one of the others is droning on and everybody's bored, they get anxious even though it isn't their meeting. They feel responsible for everyone else's experience. Okay, that's when your need is control. Number 2 is perfection. Some of us are perfectionists. They believe that they have to get everything perfectly right the first time, which if you pause, or if you're not a perfectionist, that sounds so unreasonable. Like, what? Who gets everything perfectly right the first time? But if you're a perfectionist, you're saying, well, nobody, but I should. Right? Their minimum standard for themselves is expert on all things. A mistake is Armageddon. When you compliment a perfectionist, they might even correct you to your face. You'd say, hey, well done, you did a fantastic job. And they're thinking, here's how I could have done it better. Okay? So that's those who have that as their main issue, perfectionist. Number 3, people who need to know the answer. They have a really hard time saying, I don't know. They're too quick with advice. They want you to know that they know something, like a 4th grader in the classroom showing the teacher that they know the answer. Pick me. They're often covering an insecurity about feeling stupid. And the author confesses that's one of his, that he's had for a long time. Part of that inner critic that we talked about last week. And so for him, it's very important to know the answer. Number 4, always being there for people. That should say always being there for others. Always being there for others. Sometimes we have trouble discerning the difference between your need to be needed and that person's actual need. These folks often overcommit, and they have anxious need to be helpful. I need to help you. Now, often they will not want to be helped themselves. That will be very difficult for them to receive help, but they will show up and they'll want to help. But that helping can actually is one of those core needs that if we're not getting it, that false narrator can start to really send the alarm bells. And then the last one is number 5, people who need approval. Again, I've shared before, this is one of mine. It feels like Armageddon anytime someone is disappointed in you or is critical of you. And if you're prone to people-pleasing, you end up in other people's brains. You think about what are they thinking about this? What are they thinking about me? What do they think of me? How did they take that last conversation we had? Maybe I shouldn't have been this. Maybe I should have been more of that. And we replay that in our heads because we're trying to, we want approval. At the worst, the people pleaser will exhaust themselves, becoming a chameleon, becoming whatever you need them to be in order for them to be okay. The author confesses to one of those as well. So the question is, where do you find yourself on the big 5? As I shared some of those traits. Again, you don't put your hand up. Control! No, don't put your hand up. But which one of those resonates with you? Maybe more. I have more than one on there. I don't want to tell you all of them. I wouldn't say all 5, but it's not uncommon. Some of you might be like, gosh, I have the whole checklist. Some might just be 1 or 2 or 3. But these are these false needs that we have that are built around these things. We'll just go back to that list. When you look at these are the human sources for chronic anxiety. But they're also character traits of God. God is in control. We don't have to be. We can trust. We can trust Him. Number 2, perfection. Well, God is perfect. We can make mistakes and we can grow. Number 3, God knows everything. You don't always have to know the answer. It doesn't all depend on you. We get to be curious and learn. Number 4, God is there for everyone. I can't be, but He can be. We don't have to exhaust ourselves in what's called a God complex or a Messiah complex by trying to be there for everybody. And lastly, number 5, approval. instead of striving for others, the approval of others, we can know that God gives approval. We can rest in that. We get anxious when we try to carry a God-sized load rather than a human-sized load. When we try to operate in these things, when we try to have control, when we try to be perfect, when we try to always know the answer, when we try to always be there for people, or we try to earn everyone's approval, man, those things are so tiring. Often we operate out of this false narrator that's telling us, you better do this. You better do this. You better get that need met. And we don't even realize how tired we are till we crash, or we burn out, or we have a vacation, or we have a spouse or a friend who says, whoa, hey, are you okay? Because we're trying to carry a load that's too big for us. That's a God-sized load. But we need to carry a human-sized load. And I really appreciate that term and from Steve Cuss, and it's been so helpful in my own personal life. Just to think that it's not a surprise to God that I'm human-sized. Like, God is not surprised that I can't meet all of these standards. It doesn't surprise Him in the least. He's actually the only qualified being in all the universe that meets all of these things. And so for me to not meet it, I can rest in that. I can be like, wow, I didn't realize that God knew I was human. That I can be human-sized. I don't have to nurture a God complex in one or all of these areas. I can rest in that. So I want to look at this passage, just a couple of verses in Genesis, because we see some of these things that happen. Genesis 3:1, now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. You will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So here we can see, well, one, there's an unreliable narrator. Eve begins to listen to the serpent, who's feeding her a story that is not the same story that God fed her. That God has given to Adam and Eve, and they walked closely with God. They had fellowship with God, and yet the serpent comes and crafts a different narrative. It's an unreliable narrator. And then Eve starts to feel these false needs. The serpent sows doubt. When you look at what the serpent says to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Well, then Eve starts to wonder, what? No. And she corrects. No, we may eat for the fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle, and you must not touch it. So can you feel the anxiety rising? Can you imagine that? It'll be like, wait a minute. What did God really say? Did God really say you can't eat anything from this whole garden? Really? And she's thinking, no, He just said we couldn't have from the one. But you can almost get a sense of the anxiety rising. Wait, what did God really say? And then the serpent provides more of the unreliable narrative. Oh, you will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be open and you'll be just like God. Don't you want to be like God? You'll know good and evil. So there's a certain level of self-reliance. There's a temptation to be like, hey, You don't need God to be God. You could be God. You'll know just like He does. What if you had the control and the perfectionism and you could be there for people and you would have the approval? What if you could substitute yourself for God? So it makes sense that we have this gap in our faith, that we struggle to notice God's presence when we're full of reactivity, we're full of anxiety and these things that happen. The things that are happening deep down inside of us, things that are running the tape, the recording that plays in the back of our heads that we don't take time to identify, we just sort of live in the reactivity. Our reactivity tells us to trust ourselves instead of relaxing into God's presence. I want you to take a deep breath. What if you could relax into God's presence? What if you could just be human-sized? Here's one of the tools I want us to consider. Jesus died so I don't have to do this anymore. I don't have to control. Put one of the big 5 in there. Whatever yours was. Jesus died so I don't have to get people's approval anymore. Jesus died so I don't have to be perfect anymore. Jesus died so I don't have to try to meet every person's needs anymore. Jesus died so I don't have to always know the answer anymore. We can exchange our need to sit in that power seat, to live in this reactivity. We can exchange our own self-reliance for a reliance on Christ. Jesus died so I don't have to exhaust myself in worry about what other people think. Or I can make a mistake and learn and not be judged by God for that. Because our reactivity pushes us to depend more on ourselves than on Him. And this is part of why we have that gap. Say, God, why? I know you're real. Why don't I experience you? And when we're caught up in the reactivity and we're caught up trying to exert control or get approval or whatever it is, it's so hard for God to be God because we're not letting Him. We say, well, no, I'll take that. I'll handle the control. I'll handle the perfection. I'll be there for everyone. I'll get my approval from everyone else. But we know this. When you pause, you say, boy, that's exhausting. It affects our physical health too. Our reactivity causes us to depend on ourselves, so we no longer notice God. Here's another reminder. God is already in the room. Part of what I relate to in this book and with this author is that he's got chaplain experience in hospitals. His was at a much higher level than mine, but it was part of my training, and I can relate to some of his anecdotes. And I have found this to be true as well, that there's times when I've had a call as a pastor to go into a very difficult situation. A few years ago, I got a call, and there was a mother whose baby had died in the hospital. And it was SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And there was no answer, and they didn't know what to do. But they called me, and they said, Pastor, please come. This mom is here. Her baby has died. She is trying to wrap her head around that. And we want you to come. So, you stop, I don't know, changing your winter tires over or whatever I was doing that day. You say, okay, we better go. This is important. I start to pray, God, what do you want me to say? What do you want me to do? How do I show up for this? Like, what do you do when someone's baby has just died, and you got to go and meet with that family in the hospital room? What do you say? What do you do? And I was reminded of this truth that God is already present. Oh, I tell you, that helped. I can remember I was driving over the overpass just north of town, right by the hospital. I was driving over the overpass when that sunk in for me, because I was like, okay, all of a sudden, this is acute anxiety for that mom in that situation. It's like horrible, it's traumatic. What's just happened? And I'm driving there to try to bring the presence of Christ, to minister to that need. And it hit me, and that's why I love hearing, we got to hear this again and again. It hit me as I was driving on the upper side of the overpass, heading east. God is already there. I'm not bringing him with me. Just because the pastor arrived, God's here now. I brought him. No, friends. This is good news, friends. God is already there. He's already in the room with you when you have to go to that situation. He's already ahead of you in the future as you face the unknown. And then when you show up, you just have to be you. You get to be human-sized. You don't have to try to be God-sized. He's already there being God, being God-sized. You just show up with what you have, which is you. And that's a real gift. And my hope for us is that as these truths sink in, again, it takes more than one day and one sermon and one time through, but as this stuff sinks in, that your life would just have a reduction in anxiety and reactivity. And that as that reduces, you experience God more intimately. That the gap between what you know about God and what you experience with God gets narrower and narrower. And I'm encouraged even by the author who's been at this for over a decade and teaches it all over. He said, look, I am only able to practice this about 10 to 15% of the time in my life, and I teach it. I literally wrote the book. I've done the research. I've gone to school. I've been doing it for years. But he said, even the 10 to 15% of the time, if we can have this awareness of our reactivity and bring God in and be reminded, what if we didn't have to be as we thought? And if God is already in the room, what if we can remember these things? He said, even at 10 to 15%, he's like, it changes my life. It changes how you relate to God and how he's able to show up in your life. And that's my prayer, that you would experience that as we learn these lessons and begin to apply it together. As we get permission to be human-sized. I give you permission. It's not from me, it's from God, but we give you permission to be human-sized. That doesn't surprise God in any way. And my hope is that as you carry that, the next time you feel that reactivity building, you say, I just have to be human-sized. I don't have to be God-sized. And you can identify what's mine to handle and what's God's to handle and what's theirs to handle. And as we work together, I do think you'll find a greater level of freedom in Christ. Amen.